I'm pleased to introduce Sue Stacey, who has been working in the early childhood field for over 35 years and is the author of several books, including Emergent Curriculum in Early Childhood, Pedagogical Documentation in Early Childhood, and a resource that is very familiar to New Brunswick educators, Inquiry-Based Early Learning Environments. They would have received that in their pedagogical documentation toolkits. The topic we're going to be discussing today is about children's art experiences and the opportunities that we as educators can provide children, the experiences with a variety of materials, exploring those materials, co-exploring those materials that really will represent their thinking and their ideas. And we're also going to be talking about the value of focusing on the process of the experience rather than the finished product. So for many educators, the idea of an art experience would involve exploring materials and investigating them, determining what materials can do, and we might refer to that as process art. And for others, the art experience might focus on the finished product, a product that an educator might have asked the children to produce. So the focus is really on that, and we might refer to that as product-focused art. What might your definition be of process and product-focused art?
It's something I talk a lot about with student educators that I work with. And we've thought about this in terms of process being very open-ended, an open-ended exploration of materials that honors the child's right to develop confidence with materials, to experiment, to create from their own point of view, not the educator's point of view. So the product-oriented approach would be something that the educator has in mind that the children should produce, and there might even be some demonstration of how to do that or some things to put together. Whereas process-oriented is about creativity, exploring materials on their own level, and thinking about their own ideas. And of course, this takes a great deal of time and messing about, as I like to term it, messing about with materials from infancy onwards. Infants, toddlers, and preschool children need this time to explore materials, because what they're doing, in effect, is creating an artistic identity, finding out what they think about materials and what can these materials do, how can I make a mark on the page. Those types of things are all involved in process, not product.
When we think of the image of children as competent and capable and co-constructors of their own learning, how will that play? And you've mentioned infants, toddlers, and preschool children, and some educators may think that infants and toddlers are not capable of exploring materials. How might you respond to that?
Oh, I believe that all ages are I mean, they're curious. They're so curious. They're so interested in everything we put in front of them. They're exploring the world and how it works. Same with art materials. They want to know. So certainly, as long as materials are non-toxic, infants can explore them. We know that they will put some things in their mouths, and as long as the material is natural and non-toxic, that's fine. It's fine for them to be super messy, as a toddler will be. They need these sensory experiences. We know that it fires neurons in the brain when children have sensory experiences. So for instance, behind us here, we have some images that children have produced. On the far left-hand side at the bottom is a simple drawing by a toddler. When you put pencils in the hands of toddlers at a very young age, at 18 months, and allow them to scribble and scribble and scribble and make marks on many different types of papers, this is the kind of result that you get. These marks are sort of almost symbolic. And they will progress as the child has more experience with many different types of pencils and paper. So we see in other communities, let's say in Italy, in Reggio Emilia, infants are given real clay, mounds of it, as soon as they're sitting up and able to sit up independently and handle the clay with their fingers. They practice pinching it and pulling it and making holes in it in infancy. The result being that by the time that they're 5 years old, they are very competent with clay. We've all seen the types of things that come out of Reggio Emilia. That comes from experience and from messing about.
Would you As an educator and providing materials for infants and then toddlers, is it adding materials? How might that progress as children increase in age? And what should educators be aware of?
Certainly, when we first introduce art materials to the very youngest children, we would put out certainly there would be shelving with supplies for children to help themselves to always, materials should be accessible. When we first begin to introduce these materials, maybe there would be fewer because too much choice for a toddler can be overwhelming. And so there might be fewer materials, but we build and we build and we build as they become more competent, as they become used to using paint, washing brushes, which they should do themselves, putting it away, putting tops on the paint pots, those types of things. As they develop competence and independence, we just simply add more until by the time they get to be 3 years old, there's this huge array of art materials to choose from.
So you've started to touch upon the components of the environment, setting the stage, that purposeful planning with respect to props and materials. When we look at the various components of the environment, the either indoor or outdoor physical space, because much of this also takes place in the outdoor physical space, and the props and materials, the time and the interactions. Might you speak to those various components? So for instance, the physical space. What should educators consider when purposefully planning the indoor or outdoor physical space?
Well, if we think as an art space as being like a studio, an atelier for children, I've always used that space as the center of the classroom. It's the hub, because so much goes on in that kind of a space. So it needs to be a highly organized space. Often I like to put it in the center of a classroom, somewhere in the middle that can be seen from all angles of the classroom. And so when we talk about organization, we need things that are visible to children so that they can see what's available when they have an idea or they want to experiment with something. They can see the materials. So when things are clumped together, for instance, if a whole bunch of paintbrushes are clumped together, all different kinds of paintbrushes in a big pot, tall and short, wide and thick, those are all good things to have, those varieties, but they need to be spaced out so that children can actually see them and make an intentional choice. A thin paintbrush is going to act differently than a thick paintbrush. And when you present them so that children can see them clearly, then they have to make an intentional choice. Which paintbrush am I going to use? So simple things like that can make a big difference in how children are intentional with materials. There needs to be, of course, a variety of materials themselves. And often we think in terms of paint and maybe clay and crayons or markers, colored pencils, those types of things. But what about things like mesh and loose parts, the unusual materials that we might not have had much experience with ourselves? Those things, as we expand our knowledge of loose materials and the children's knowledge, they need to be clearly visible as well. So again, highly organized. I like to use low shelving. I do like to have myself a light or white backdrop so that the materials stand out in their trays or in their baskets. And a word about baskets, we all love to use them. They're very beautiful, they're very natural. We use them a lot these days in our classrooms. But the thing is with baskets, you can't see through them. They're not transparent. But if they're shallow baskets, great, the children can see inside them. So it's no good, for instance, say, having a great big deep cardboard box or deep basket full of, let's say, cardboard tubes of many different shapes and sizes, if the child can't see what's in that deep container. So we have to be very intentional with the way that we're setting up. And the other thing is that we need preferably natural light. Now, many childcare centres are in borrowed spaces, and some of them are in basements, and they don't have the luxury of a really bright, naturally lit classroom. It really is a treat to have that. But wherever we can, to put the easel, for instance, and I do believe an easel should be a part of every art area. It's surprising to me how many art areas don't have an easel. Many affordable ways to provide an easel, but that easel should be by the window. window if it's available. And it should be double-sided, and there should be different kinds of paints on each side and an assortment of tools to use with those paints. So we're thinking simplicity together with variety and high organization, and the upkeep of this area is very important, because dirty paint pots are, that are sort of gloopy and unattractive are not going to invite the child in. So the paint pots need to be cleaned at the end of each day, and children can do that themselves. They would love to do that. Toddlers would love to have the paint pots and a pot of soapy water to wash them in. It's attractive to them. So it's not that the educator has to do all this. The children can do it too. This level of organization can be modeled, and it can be a task that we all do together to keep it all organized, clean and tidy and attractive. We can talk about that with the children. Our paintbrushes won't work if they're stiff with paint. We have to wash our paintbrushes afterwards at the end of the day. Those types of practical things.
You've addressed physical space and props, materials, and loose parts. Time is such a consideration, that uninterrupted time. What might you offer educators around the idea of time and providing time?
It's a huge piece of developing sort of art, approaches to art, ways that children use materials. It's a huge part of the process. They need uninterrupted time. And by uninterrupted, I mean there's no need to be asking questions of children all the time when they're engaged in a process of working with art materials. And some people say that, infants and toddlers have very short attention spans. But actually, when I see them with art materials, they can have very long attention spans and be very focused and engaged to the point where they're not hearing or seeing anything else. They are totally engaged with what they're doing. All children, and we as adults, we are the same. We as adults would not be appreciative of someone, if we were involved in some sort of project, whatever it is, we would not be appreciative of somebody coming by every 10 minutes and asking us questions. If we're involved in reading a book, and we're totally engrossed and concentrated, we don't appreciate being interrupted. And so for children, it's the same. When they're very engaged with art materials, they're in a state of what we call flow. And Csikszentmihalyi, which is a mouthful, but he's a very prolific author, he wrote a book called Flow that describes this process, that we are relaxed and yet we are alert at the same time and very focused. And that's a lovely state to be in. We experience it when we're really enjoying something. We as adults experience it. Children experience it too. So to get into that state of flow takes time. An art project, an art experience shouldn't be a 10-minute experience. The material should be available all through playtime. Let's say that their play period in the morning, I would hope that it's something like an hour and a half without, play, without being interrupted. The art materials are there for them to use all through that period. And hopefully again at another time of day when they come in from outdoors, and hopefully sometimes outdoors as well. Easels outdoors on the fences, for instance. But that uninterrupted time is so important, because children need to experience that lovely feeling of relaxation and focus that comes from art.
I'm wondering if I can take you back. I'm just thinking of a conversation you and I had earlier, and I'm wondering if I could take you back to the physical space. And some of the displays, you referred to pieces of art for children to explore by other artists and such. Could you speak just a little bit about that and the benefits of having other art available for children?
It's very inspiring to young children, and we don't think about this as much in early childhood education, I think, as we should. Children are inspired by the ways that other artists work, and when we have artwork that has, for instance, strong black lines, and when we have artwork that is about topics that the children are interested in. So let's say we're looking at a painting of ballerinas, and there are some children in that class who are taking dance lessons. That art is going to be of interest to them. So we can seek out art from famous artists, modern, present day, local, from our own community, Indigenous, all sorts of art from all over the world, from the past, from the present, and have those art books around the classroom or beautiful pieces of art, prints, matted and put on the wall at their level so that children can look at these and talk about them. What happens then is that it gives the educator, and this is one of the roles of the educator, an opportunity to talk about the art. We as educators might not be very experienced in talking about art. It might not be something that's part of our repertoire. But if we let our natural curiosity bubble up to the surface, it's easy to talk about art because we can wonder with the children. So I wonder, look at that interesting mark. I wonder why the artist put that there. And I wonder how they made that mark. And then the same thing happens with illustrations in children's books. Beautiful illustrators these days in children's literature. And we can focus in on that as a piece of art. That is art. Illustration is an art. And so we can focus in on that and say, here's your favorite story. Here's how the pictures look. Look at this illustration. This artist, the background is not the same as the people in the front. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they used photography in the background and a cartoon figure in the front of the picture? Why do you think he did that? I'm referring to Nuffle Bunny, who many early childhood educators will know. The children that I worked with noticed this because they were used to looking at illustrations in the art of illustration. They were used to discussing that. After every storybook, we would talk about the illustrations and how they were made. And so the children noticed in Nuffle Bunny, the background is a photograph. They recognize that as a photograph. But these people at the front, they are like cartoons and they are made with paint or something like that. So we talked about that a lot. And then behind us, we have the example, second from the right on the bottom row, you see the black and white painting, the child at the easel. This is in response to Harry the Dirty Dog, another piece of really, it's an old favorite, of a white dog with black spots that changes into a black dog with white spots. So here is something that the children were fascinated with, this idea of transformation. We talked about that illustration throughout that book a lot. They went back to it and back to it. And so we provided all colors of paints at the easel, as we always do, but we also made sure that black and white paint was there, not for any specific reason, not with any expectation, not with any direction to the children, but just to be there just in case they chose to represent something from the book if they wanted to. And so this child went to the easel and he is creating Harry the Dirty Dog, first on white paper, and then on the other side of the easel, black paper, which was very intentional by the teachers to see what would happen when you use black and white paint on each of these surfaces. It's going to be a different result. A little bit of a cognitive knot for the children, quite challenging to work with, but very interesting for us to watch. And again, we didn't give any instructions, no suggestions. We just stood back. We just presented the materials and stood back to see what would happen, and lots happened. Very interesting to use illustrations as a form of art.
And the Barbara Reed books, who uses clay and plasticine. What kind of conversations have you had with children?
I've had huge conversations over the years with children about Barbara Reed. And there are some old videos online that you can access where she speaks to how she uses the materials to make illustrations. And we showed the children her process in that video because they were very interested in how it was made, how these illustrations, how this book was made. So what she does is she in the video, she shows children how she pinches the clay to make leaves, how she rolls it to make thin lines. And so the children and I were able to talk about, okay, so you can press it flat, you can stretch it out, you can make lines with clay. And then Barbara Reed's photographers photographed these creations of hers that were quite wonderful and detailed. And that's how the book was made. So the children were, I'm talking about 3- and 4-year-olds, very interested in that process. And of course, eventually began making sculptures and pictures of their own out of clay.
Another extremely important component of the environment are the relationships and the interactions. And in your book, Inquiry-Based Early Learning Environments, actually on page 52, you state, We have seen how a rich environment full of engaging and open-ended materials can promote and support curiosity and therefore inquiry. How, though, can teachers' own actions and dispositions encourage curiosity in children?
The teacher's disposition really matters. I think it's really important that we ourselves are comfortable with materials. We can only support curiosity and skill with materials if we feel a certain level of confidence and curiosity about them ourselves. So I think, the modeling piece is very important. Not modeling how to use the materials, because we don't want to influence children in that way, not modeling what to do, but modeling a sense of openness around materials and risk-taking. It's okay for an educator to put something out, something new that you've brought to the classroom. Let's say the children have never used mesh before, or natural clay. Let's say they've never used those materials before and the educator is bringing them in. The educator herself or himself, they might not be very experienced with those materials. So it's okay to say to children, I'm not really sure how this is going to work. So let's explore it together. Like, what can we do with this? How does it work? And to be there with the children as they experiment and to comment on what they're trying, so that, so-and-so, you're rolling it up. So was it hard to do that, or is it really stiff? And, you're putting your pieces of clay together. So what are you thinking? And how you're trying to make it stick together, and let's see if we can make that work. There are some little tips that you can give children to make something work, and we're going to look at that a bit later in a demonstration, in a practical demonstration. There are little things that children need to know about making something work when it's a very sort of a little bit more of a sophisticated material. And these little tips can help them a lot. But the important thing is that we're not trying to influence what they make or what they do. We're trying to help them make it work for themselves so that they can be creative. So the interactions, the disposition of the teacher should be open, flexible, willing to take a chance, make themselves a little bit uncomfortable, to go there and to experience that disequilibrium, not quite knowing what's going to happen. I talk about disequilibrium a lot in all of my books, that disequilibrium is a good thing, that it keeps us on this growing edge, that if we're a little bit uncomfortable, we're growing, we're not stuck in a rut. And I think that's very important, that idea of embracing disequilibrium on the part of the teacher.
When we also talk about relationships, we talk about relationships with parents and families, and certainly acknowledging the parents as a child's first and most influential teacher. What might you offer educators to support their relationships with parents, specifically around art experiences, perhaps informing parents or just supporting parents' understanding of the importance of the process of children's art?
Yes, it's an important piece. Some parents worry about their children becoming really messy. And I think when a child joins a center or a classroom, it's really important to put that out there, to say to parents when they're doing a tour of the center, for the director to be saying, you'll notice how messy the children are getting. This is part of our curriculum. It's necessary. It's sensory. It helps build the brain. We get very messy, so I would advise you never to put your child in really good clothes to come to preschool or to their toddler classroom, because we are going to get messy, and to put it right out there up front. One parent that I had some years ago decided, on seeing the messiness of my classroom, she decided she was going to put her toddler in a white T-shirt every day. She had like a dozen white T-shirts from Target. This was in the US, like Target. She went to Target and bought dozens of them. And she put her child in a white T-shirt. And the other parents were like, why would you choose a white T-shirt? And she said, because I can bleach it. I can get covered in red.
I thought you were going to
say
so she could get a new art creation each day.
No, she said he can get as messy as he wants, and I'll just throw it in the washing machine. I'll just bleach them, and they're all the same, and I'll just throw them in the washing machine. It's fine. And that worked beautifully. So there's that. There's the messy piece, and parents have to be given information upfront about that. Why it's good for children to be messy. They're not going to get these types of experiences at home, probably. And so we can say that to parents. It's unlikely, that you're going to be using finger paint all the time at home, but we do. So it's necessary for your child to be wearing old clothing. It doesn't matter if it gets dirty. And we'll do what we can to protect their clothing, but we can't keep them clean. And that has to be said. The other thing is that parents love to see these. I don't like the word cute at all. I think it's sort of a demeaning word. But parents like to see cute things coming home for the Christmas tree, or something to give as a little gift, from the child to the parent or the grandparent. And sometimes, because of their own experiences as children, they have this expectation that that's what's going to come home. When we are process-oriented, this is not what's going to go home. And that, again, needs to be explained to parents, that this creative act, this learning how to use art materials, this thinking for themselves, this intentionality is much more important than a little product that's going to come home beautifully made. And so my message to parents has always been, do you want my work to come home to you, which is going to look very put together and appropriate for whatever celebration, or do you want the child's work to come home? Because if you want the child's work to come home, it's not going to look like anything you recognize. Probably not till they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old. You're not going to get anything you recognize, but it's going to be theirs. And you can talk with them about it, and they'll tell you the meaning behind what they did and how they did it. That's important. And most parents that I've worked with will buy into that. They understand that. The other thing we can do is to have parents' nights, parent meetings, where they use the materials, and they use them in different ways, so that they can see the difference between doing something that's very dictated and narrow, as opposed to an experience that's very broad, experiential, creative, and how that feels and what they learn from it. That's a useful discussion to have.
One other very important discussion that certainly provokes a lot of questions and challenges is the issue around coloring books and coloring sheets. And, many educators might respond by saying, well, the children love them. But what guidance might you offer educators around the idea of coloring books and coloring sheets in early childhood?
So I've heard, I'm not a fan of them, and have never used them in the classroom, because there's so much more to do with art materials than coloring in. But I've heard coloring in and coloring books being described as a mindless activity. It doesn't require very much intention from the child. It's rigid in that they're supposed to stay within the lines, that they're supposed to use certain colors. Some adults remember as a child that they found it comforting or relaxing, and actually there are adult coloring books now for relaxation purposes, and some adults enjoy that. But really, for the child, I can't think of any benefits of using a coloring book. Often the images in a coloring book are very stereotypical. They don't represent real life. They might be cartoonish. There might be a stereotypical little girl in a dress and, curly, long hair, and the old stereotypical. These images are not usually modern, or else they don't represent the diverse world that we live in. Very narrow in their outlook. And my response to that is, if the child wants to color in something, why can't they draw something to color in? Draw their own design. I've seen children make huge scribbles all over a page, sort of very loose scribbles, and then color in the shapes. It's their design, it's their creation. It comes from them, much better than a coloring book.
When we talk about children's creations, what might you offer educators about displaying those creations and celebrating the children's work in a respectful, beautiful way that really does celebrate the children's work and the children's thinking and their representing? What might you offer educators about that?
Yes, it's important to validate their work by sharing it, displaying it. I like to use a mat of some sort. We can't all afford to get frames and frame children's work, but certainly mats, the matting that is used in the framing process, if we just use the mats at least, we can let's say, pick up on the colors of the child's creation. Let's say, there's a lot of red in their painting. We can use a contrasting mat, or we can use a mat that contains red to just tape around the tape on the back side so it's not showing, to tape that painting into that mat and put it up on the wall, and please make sure it's level. Because when we display things carefully and it's level, it's almost like gallery style, if you like. It's like, and children can peruse and see each other's work, which is lovely. We can photograph it and send it home if the child wants a copy, or if they want to keep their original. Certainly we can photograph it and print it off, and we can display their work that way. We can display it in documentation. Pedagogical documentation is a whole other topic, but we can use their art in documentation. We can use it to send home digitally. There's all sorts of ways to share it. The other thing I often do is to bring children's art, if it's something that's really thought-provoking or unusual, or that the child wants to talk about, has a big explanation about. Sometimes I would bring that to a morning gathering and share that, because the child has something to say about it. So for instance, in the center, fourth one from the right here, the center image, it would be hard to know what that is unless it was explained. And so I wouldn't put that up on the wall unless the child had had a chance to explain it to her peers. In this case, it was very important that this child had this avenue of painting at the easel, because she didn't speak a word of English. She spoke Greek at home, and she was 4 years old and very, very upset to be separated from her parents. Took a long time to settle in. The easel for her was almost a form of therapy. It was relaxing. It calmed her when she first arrived. She loved the story of the three little pigs. She knew it in Greek. And this is her image of the story of the three little pigs. With the three pigs are there, the chimney is there, the big bad wolf is there. She knew that story inside out, but she couldn't say it. And so she is using art as a language. This is an alternate language for her. This is something she could communicate. And again, this is why it's so important to always have the easel there with the materials, the art materials there, for children to be able to communicate with art. And this is a lovely example of that. And what happened at morning gathering is, of course, she couldn't explain this in English, but as teachers, we recognized what it was. And so we were able to tell the story of the three little pigs. And she was nodding. Most children who are learning a second language have better receptive language than expressive language. She was recognizing what we were saying and nodding and smiling, and felt very validated by the sharing of this artwork, because she couldn't do it herself. It came through the art.
Are there other stories that you'd like to share about some of the other pieces of art that you've brought?
Yes, I'd like to draw attention to, on the bottom row, second and third from the left, you can probably see that these are drawings of a bird of some sort. Actually, these are, there was a big stuffed owl in the classroom that I don't know where it came from. Someone donated to us. It was huge. A very big presence in the classroom when it was first brought in. So the children were quite fascinated with this thing. They touched it a lot. They noticed its talons. They noticed the camouflage, the patterns in the feathers. Very interesting to them, of course, very intriguing. So I just wanted to point out the difference in how children represented that owl. The first one, the drawing, is very, very detailed. There's all sorts of stripes and every little detail, the beak, the talons, the wings, everything is there, but the amount of detail is incredible. That took about 30 or 40 minutes to do. The one to its right is much more simplistic. It's still a representation. It's at the child's own level. It's using paint, but we can see, again, that the stripes have captured the child's attention. The face is quite schematic in that it's a smiley face rather than representing the beak. This is where the child is at developmentally in terms of art. Both of these representations were done by 4-year-olds, 2 months apart in age, completely different. And this is what we see when we provide many rich experiences, props, inspirations, tools. This is what we see, are these huge differences. We're not looking for a particular level of development, but it's interesting for us to notice. And the more that we expand the materials and the experiences, the more confident and the more skilled they'll become with drawing and painting.
And the finger painting above?
Yes. Above that, you can see the purple finger painting. Oh my gosh, I included that because of the joy on the child's face. I mean, art should be joyful. There shouldn't be any worry about what we're making. It should be joy in the process and creativity. So you can see that this child, you can see the purple finger paint on her hands. The hands are up. She's up to her elbows in paint, which is wonderful. But I love that joyful expression. The finger painting was done just on the table. And we made a monoprint by just pressing paper over top and lifted it up. And that moment of reveal when they saw the imprint of their painting was very special. A couple of other things. Next to that, to the right of that finger painting photograph, you see a child folding mesh. This is a very soft mesh, a very fine mesh. And it was put out originally in the classroom because the children were using clay, and they wanted the clay to be able to stand, to make a standing figure. They had a great deal of trouble with that. And we know from potters, and this is where the educator has to go outside of her own field and do some research. We found out from potters that mesh is used often as an armature. So you build something with mesh. It could be tall and skinny in order to support a clay sculpture of a person. It's a support. So that was our intention in putting the mesh out for children to use as a support for clay. But that's not how they used it. Of course, they didn't. They often take their own path. And so in that center photograph, the child is rolling the mesh just to see how it feels and just to experience it. And he was making tubes and looking through the tubes and all sorts of different things. But in the next photograph to the right, the children have taken the squares of mesh and they've taken them to the table where the watercolor painting was set up. And what they figured out is that you can paint through mesh. They figured this out by themselves. We didn't have to do anything. The mesh is there. The children have put it on the table with the paint. So the mesh is placed on top of the paper. They painted through it. And they figured that because it's full of holes, the paint will go through. And they're quite right. It did. So all sorts of interesting effects. From that, they discovered that if you lift it and you rub your paintbrush over it, it will spatter. And so you get a different effect again. So all of this came from just having the materials available, accessible, visible, and being able to move them around the room, not being confined to one area, but be able to take them and combine them with something else. The picture on the far right, that inspiration at the top, that inspiration came from a book about fairy houses. And there was a whole group of mostly girls, one little boy, but mostly girls who were fascinated with fairy houses and were making them outside with rocks and twigs and leaves, those types of things, all the natural materials that you would find outside. To bring that in, what we did was we invited them to bring those materials in with them. Whatever they found outside, they put those in. The fairy book you can see in the background, you know, they poured over this book. They loved it. They would look at it over and over again and began to take inspiration. So what you see in the foreground is leaves and clay, which again they brought from another shelf, leaves and clay to hold it all together and some popsicle sticks to make something upright. This is their fairy house. So they brought the outdoors indoors and used just about all the materials that they had available. And then there's one other picture I would like to bring attention to, third from the right on the bottom row, that very black painting. This was interesting because this child would not, for some reason, would not go anywhere near art materials. We couldn't entice him, whatever we tried, to come to the easel, to come to a table. We certainly don't want to force children to take part in art, but most children, when they see unusual materials, they're curious. You know, it's inviting. It draws them in, not for him. He was a very sort of sciencey type of child. And so he was interested in inventing things, which is great. You know, he used all the loose parts. He was always inventing. But one day, out of the blue, you know, the materials are always there. They're always inviting, silently inviting. One day he came over to the easel and he did this. And he used a feather from somewhere in the classroom. He glued a feather onto his easel paper. He made a little drawing. That's where the open space is. He made a little drawing. It didn't seem to have anything to do with the feather, but it was in pencil. And then he painted the black all around them. Very thick, very dark. He wasn't going to talk about his painting. He had nothing to say about it when we sort of tried to engage him in conversation. So it was left for us to wonder, what is this about? You know, to be curious about. And there's something about black paint, I think, that is very powerful for children. Sometimes we're dismayed when children will paint something quite beautiful or draw something quite beautiful and then cover it up. They paint right over top of it. But for me, I think how I interpret that, and it's still a bit of a puzzle for me, I think how I interpret that is it's the power of being able to cover something and uncover something. It's mine. I can cover it up. I can wash it all out. I can do anything I want with this painting. There's something very powerful about black, very dark and very strong, and children love to use black. So this is an example of something we didn't completely understand, which is fine, no problem.
Sue, at the end of each of your chapters in inquiry-based early learning environments, you end each chapter with the section, Something to Try. Yes. I'm wondering, as we come to the end of this discussion, what might you invite or challenge educators? What might be the something to try?
So I think, and I'm going to refer to my notes here because I gave this some thought in advance. And so I think if we think of art as a language, we have to ourselves understand that language as educators. We have to become comfortable with art materials, with art processes. Maybe that's not the way that we learned about art in our own youth. Maybe that's not the way it was presented to us in our training programs as early childhood educators. But I was thinking, if as an invitation to leave with you, if educators thought about a feeling, it could be joy, it could be sadness, it could be excitement, a feeling rather than a concrete thing. If you think about that feeling, how would you represent it with art materials? And I would invite you to try that in your sessions with your facilitators, to try expressing a feeling with any art material, paint, collage, clay, drawing materials, mark-making materials, any of those things that we share with children, to use them ourselves and to be comfortable with them. So what's the feeling you would like to express, and how will you express it? That's the challenge I would leave you with. So what we're going to do now is explore some materials we're just going to mess about, because sometimes not every educator has had the chance to use clay and watercolors and things like charcoal and different kinds of pencils. So we'll explore this a little bit, and it might help you introduce these materials to children. And my hope is that after this session, you'll be able to experiment with these materials yourself. So first of all, clay. This is natural clay. It's quite, when it's moist, it's quite sticky. It's very malleable. You have to keep clay moist in order for children to be able to use it, because if it hardens, of course, it's going to be brittle, and it's going to be very stiff. Clay does provide a great deal of strengthening of fine motor muscles, so it is good that it's a little bit stiff. It behaves completely differently than plasticine, modeling clay, and things like Play-Doh, which doesn't stick to itself, so it's not very satisfying in terms of trying to make something. So with clay, you'll see that it sort of holds its shape quite nicely. Whatever you do with it, you pinch it. Often children will begin by just pinching and squeezing and stretching, finding out how much it will stretch before it breaks. But a tip that we should offer to children when they start to really build with clay is how to join it together. And there's different pieces together, and there's a particular skill to that. So if you've got two pieces like this, and let's just make one side a little flat, you can see how you can mold it even into a cube. It's very easy. You can press it to make flat sides. All sorts of ways, and children will discover this by themselves. We don't need to teach them this. This is something they will learn. But if I wanted to join this piece to this piece, I would use a little tool like this. You don't have to have a special clay tool. You can use something like a toothpick, something like that. And what you do is you provide a little bit of sort of cross-hatching. You do this. You cross-hatch each side with a sharp implement, and then you wet it. You'll always need water around when you're using clay, so you wet it a little bit, and then it will stick. And when it dries, it will be very strong. It will stay there. So one thing about wetting clay, when you're working with infants, especially, who aren't able to do as much with clay, sometimes it's nice to use just the regular moistened clay as it is, and they will pinch and they will poke and make holes, those sorts of things, but also to have them put water on it, because it will make it very sort of slippery and slimy, and that's a completely different sensory experience. So that's something, you know, another offering to make to infants. Every time you use clay, you should have a bowl of water available for the children to rinse off their hands, because you can't do this in the sink. If you do this in the sink, it will block your sink. It will harden in the pipes, and you'll get this residue. Speaking of residue, the residue is really important. When you use something like a jar or a little bowl, what you want to do is not throw this away, but to let it settle. The clay residue will settle to the bottom, and you'll get this layer of sort of like silt. And what this is, it's called slip. And when it's settled, it takes a day or so for it to settle. You keep this jar of slip, you pour the water off the top, and this residue that's in the bottom, it's precious, it's like gold. You use it like glue. So again, if you wanted to stick one piece of clay to another, you would take some of this slip like glue, and you would spread it on, and you would stick with it. And so the children can be part of monitoring this jar of slip, pouring things off, and keeping the slip in a little container always covered up. And the other thing about clay is that you do need to cover it when you're finished building, when the children are still working on something and they want to save it till the next day. You cover it with a moistened cloth. That will keep it nice and pliable, and you can keep working with it. If you accidentally leave the top off the container, or you don't moisten it, you can reconstitute it. You can put it in about an inch of water and let it soak up the water. That takes some time, and you don't really want to have to do that. And then for the children who are a little bit wary of being too messy and they don't like to be sticky, dampened cloths on the table are reassuring for them, that they can clean their hands off whenever they want to. But really, clay, as educators should know, part of the joy of using it is getting messy and feeling the consistency and the sensory aspect of the clay. So this is something for you to practice and try out and mess about with. So watercolor is a medium that I use as a sort of way of playing with paint. I like to watercolor paint, and it has a very particular way of behaving. For children, it can be very simple. One of the first things you have to decide is what kind of paper you're going to use. There is designated watercolor paper, but that tends to be kind of expensive, and it's what artists use, but there's no need for that with children. What you do need is an absorbent type of paper. So feel the kind of papers that you have in your center. They'll all have different finishes. You know, this is manila, and then there's construction paper, which I don't recommend. It becomes too soggy, because with watercolor, you do use water, obviously. Doesn't work without it. So for today, I'm just going to use small pieces, and I would say that whatever kind of paper you choose, offer it to children in different sizes. Just have it on a shelf or a table in sort of small, medium, and large, and in that way, children can become intentional. They can think about, what's my idea? Is my idea huge? Do I need this great big piece of easel paper? Or is my idea tiny? Am I going to draw a bug, you know? And then you would use a smaller piece of paper. And so if the papers are displayed nicely, the children make some intentional choices. So this has sort of a soft absorbent finish, and I'm going to use two pieces for a particular reason. I want to talk a little bit about brushes. Brushes are very important for any kind of artist, for any kind of painting, no matter what you're using. Even if you're using liquid temper, the brush is important. What comes with a watercolor set is not usually very good quality, and a brush like this, you can't get it even if it's wet. It's very hard to get it to a fine point, and you might need a fine point for some reason. So these kinds of brushes I would get rid of, and I would use something like this, which comes in a set. You can get them at places like Michael's and other art shops. They come in a set, and look at all the different shapes and sizes. So we have straight edges. This comes to a very nice point. So it is a very beautiful brush. I probably would tend to use myself that kind of brush the most. Then you've got very fine brushes, and there's no reason why children can't use these brushes. Once they're past that fist grip of toddlerhood, which with the stubby brushes and the heavy liquid paint, once they're past that stage and they're starting to hold a paintbrush more like this, there's no reason why they can't use all these very nice brushes. Of course, you have to take care of brushes if they're going to stay like this. And so what we do when we're finished is wash them off. The children can wash them off, bring them back to a point, and don't send them up like this to dry, because the water will trickle back into this metal holder of the bristles and it will rust. So you lay it flat on a piece of paper towel, and that's how they're supposed to dry, and that will make your brushes last longer. So there's a couple of things you can do with watercolor paint when introducing them to children, and you can let this happen quite naturally. So I'm going to use a thicker brush, and I'm just going to wet the paper without anything on it. No paint, no nothing, just wet paper. And when you put paint, you have to load up your wet brush, and then you can start to make marks. And what will happen with wet paint on wet paper is that the paints will run into each other, which is actually a very nice effect. And you can also just wet your brush and without putting more paint on it, and just do this. And the paint will get more and more faded. Useful for skies for those of you who are trying to represent something. So if you hold it up vertically, you can see that the paint runs quite nicely, which is a beautiful effect. Children really like this effect of running on the paper. They like to twist it in different directions. So all sorts of things you can do with wet paper. With dry paper, you can make more specific marks, of course. So you still always have to wet the brush. On dry paper, your paint is going to stay where you put it. But notice what happens when I pull the paint across the page. So if I use the side of my brush, you can make a nice thick stroke, you can fill in a lot of space. But if I use the point, the very point, you can get a very fine line and everything in between. Of course, children just need to experiment with the brushes to find out how this works, experiment with dry and with wet. What I sometimes do with children when they're first introduced to watercolor paint is I'll take a piece of paper this size and fold it in two. When children start to discover that wet paper acts differently than dry paper, I'll invite them, so what would happen? I wonder what would happen. Here's an I wonder question. If you wet one side but you didn't wet the other, what would happen? And let them experiment with that. So that's just another way of introducing wet and dry. The most important thing about materials and children is that we want children to use materials with respect. So with a brush like this, we don't want them to smush it. We don't want them to hold it like this and smush it. It's going to wreck the bristles. It won't work anymore. So one thing we can do when we're introducing a new type of brush to a child is to say, this looks a little different than the brushes you've used before. What do you see that's different? And ask them to identify what the difference is. It will likely look quite different to what they've used before. And then just say to them, with a brush like this, it's very pointy. So you could make a different kind of line with a brush like this. Why don't you try it out? And just leave them to it. Leave them to experiment with very fine lines and very thick lines. The point is that we don't want to be telling them what to do, what to make and how to make it. We don't want that at all, because then we'd be getting into product. We want to be in process. And so it's for the children to experiment. We just want to give them a couple of tips for them to be able to respect the materials and so that the materials will last. So they should be having fun with this and using it in many, many different ways. So let's talk a little bit about mark making. And even the youngest child, even an infant and a toddler, can certainly make marks. And you'll notice that when you're in the classroom yourself, as an educator, I go in a lot as a consultant. I'm often using a clipboard or a little notebook. I'll sit on the floor, engaging with the children and watching them, and I'll have a pencil or pen in my hand and a notebook or a clipboard, and I'm writing, and the infant will crawl over and take the pencil out of my hand and make marks on my clipboard or my notebook. They are so interested in this whole idea of mark making. When you think about it, you have a blank piece of paper, and for somebody who's new to this, it's quite magical to change that piece of blank paper into something else with marks. It's almost like a magic process. So many different ways to make marks, and all of these materials should be available to children, nicely displayed. So if we go to just the ordinary pencil, many people with toddlers use a chubbier pencil. And you can do that, but I find what's more important with toddlers is to use a shorter pencil because they tend to lose control as the pencil kind of moves around if it's longer. So there is the regular pencil, there are black and white drawing pencils and every shade in between. We should be aware of the difference between the different levels of softness in a pencil. A drawing pencil is going to be a certain number of HB on the side. This is marked on the side of your pencil. So some are very soft and some are very hard in terms of the lead. So we should be aware of that and how it works. Of course, we can give them different kinds of paper to work on. So a pencil can give a hard line. This is very charcoaly, very soft. It can be a very soft line and everything in between. And of course, you can shade. You know, if you're using a white pencil with a black pencil, you can create shades. And an ordinary old lead pencil it can also be very hard and very soft. These are things that children can learn, that there are many ways to use a pencil on its tip and on its side. So when they are feeling, sort of confident with a pencil, you can introduce things like a fine-tipped marker. Black markers are beautiful for exact drawings. So when we use I was referring before to the very detailed bird drawing that we saw an image of. That was done with a regular pencil, but that kind of drawing is lovely if you do it with a very fine black tip marker. It's a very fine line and it's very deep and there's a lot of contrast, and so children really like that. So fine tip markers, you can use a fine tip Sharpie, for instance. These are art markers, but you don't need to go to that expense. You could go to a stationery store like Staples and buy a package of fine tipped Sharpies. People worry about using Sharpies because they are not erasable, but really, it doesn't really matter if we get marker on our hands. It's no big deal. So black and white is very powerful, as we've seen in some of these images that we looked at earlier. White marks on black paper, this kind of shading. Children often don't think of using mark-making materials on their side. So this is something that if they accidentally do it, you can comment on. That's making a different mark. How did you make that? And then there are things when you want to start using color, like pastels. You can get chalk pastels and you can get oil pastels. These are oil, and they tend to be quite vibrant in their colors, very satisfying, very smooth. There's a lot of nice sensory feedback from an oil pastel, so they give a nice mark. And then, of course, the color is very intense, very satisfying to children. So I don't use regular crayons very often with young children because I find that the colors are not as intense and they are not as satisfying in terms of the feel of it on the page. They tend to be kind of sticky when you use them on regular paper. They tend to sort of falter and they're sometimes hard to move across the page. And so I prefer to use oil pastels. They will last a long time. They're stronger. They don't break easily. And I think are much more satisfying to children. And then we get to charcoal. Now, charcoal is very interesting. It's very delicate, and that is a word that we can use with children. You can get charcoal in different thicknesses. So you can see that this is quite thick, and this is very slender. It's very fragile. It's made from burnt wood. That's where charcoal comes from. You can actually make your own charcoal with children if you were being adventurous. But they do have to know that it's fragile, and we can use that word. We can ask them, so, this is a new material. We haven't seen this before. How is this different from a pencil? And ask them those questions when they're exploring. They will very quickly find out that when they press on a piece of charcoal, it snaps very, very easily. That will happen as soon as they use it. That's fine. So we can comment on that. That snapped really easily. So what do you think we should do? How should we use this? And then children can learn that when you use charcoal, it's a very soft motion, and then it won't break. And again, you could use it on its side. Charcoal, again, is very satisfying. It covers a lot of space in a short time. This is a little thicker. If you can find this, it's less fragile, but see, it still breaks. And that's okay. Children should not worry about charcoal breaking. It's going to happen. It happens to adults. And so they can use it in smaller pieces to start with if they want. But look at the beautiful marks that this makes, very chunky. very, very vibrant, very solid. So I would certainly offer this to children, no doubt, you know, from toddlerhood upwards, I would offer it to them just for the different experience of making all these marks. Something for you to experiment with too. Many adults have not used charcoal. So I'm going to invite you from here on in to work with your facilitator and use all these materials in many different ways so that you feel comfortable with them.